Good day, chaps. So today's video is going to cover the future main battle tank programme. This was a massive part of British tank development story, and it's rarely covered. At best it's glanced over, or indeed completely bodged by some museums. And yet it was one of the most important periods of design and development during the Cold War. Future Main Battle Tank was a joint project between the British and the Germans, and although itself ultimately a failure, it led to a large selection of designs, ideas and theories that would shape tank design of the time, and ultimately leads to why we have tanks like Challenger or even Leopard 2, and it even played some decisions around the Abrams and S-Tank, amongst others. This video will cover the vehicles and policies that have been left out of the tank books, or simply forgotten by most, and hopefully will help you, the viewer, understand a lot more about what was going on in these crucial years. Now I'll say this at the outset, that I don't know how long this video is going to be. I have over 3,000 pages on the developments taking place, and this has to be condensed down to suitable viewing, as just 6 hours on gearbox debates will dull even the most ardent tank fan. One should also take into account that many of the reports from the time are from the UK's perspective, and while they have data and schematics of some of the German vehicles, some are still missing or classified as secret by the Germans. There was also an unbelievable amount of bias from the British teams, which was recognised afterwards. And so while the facts and figures are accurate, some personal views and theories are a product of their time, and don't necessarily reflect on the current views of tank design. So what was the Future Main Battle Tank 1970? Well, to start off, it's easy to explain it's not a tank, rather a series of vehicles under a collective whole. The project came about following a meeting held by the British and the FRG, or Federal Republic of Germany, which for the sake of brevity would just be surmised as the Germans from now on. This meeting was held in 1971 and was to discuss a joint General Staff target for a new series of tanks, both conventional and unconventional, to replace the Chieftain and Leopard tanks in the 1980s. The British had already been working on a few solutions and ideas, named MBT-80, before the meeting, setting out the guidelines for what they felt was a future tank design. Now this should not be confused with the later MBT-80 project, and this original name was dropped in 1972 and just Future Main Battle Tank used. This was followed up in autumn of 1971, with the suggestion that a technical symposium be held between the two nations, to investigate the merits of concepts put forward by both the UK and Germany, and discuss the ideas and theories of tank design. During this period, and throughout the Future Main Battle Tank programme, both nations would also work on their own national projects as a failsafe, as both countries had past experience with joint projects which had not achieved their desired outcomes, at a large cost, notably the preceding German and American Main Battle Tank 70 project. The ultimate aim of the first symposium can be seen as the following: to present national concepts, to examine these concepts with special technical groups, and recommend those concepts likely to meet the GST and be economically viable. This was followed by a meeting held in London to discuss the feasibility studies based on the recommendation of the symposium, which was to clarify that an agreement could be made on the joint programme's findings, that an MOU, or a Memorandum of Understanding, between the two nations could be met, and that management proposals for the feasibility study be secured. The first meeting was held by high levels of staff from both the British and the Germans. In this meeting, hosted by the director of the MVEE, David Cardwell, they wished to outline who they were, what they were looking for based on their preliminary studies, and that they were looking for either a tank with good all-round aspects of mobility, firepower and protection, or a vehicle focusing on mobility and protection as its key features, although this definition would shift over the next few years. They also wanted to discuss the key features of what gun was deemed acceptable, what vision devices, and what fire control systems they wanted, all of which were from British firms. Immediately, it was felt by some present that this rustled a few jimmies, as a tank is more than just a military project. It is a wide scope domestically, with many outside firms depending heavily on contracts, and some there felt that the UK was already imposing its will on what should be used before the first designs had ever been considered. More importantly, though, was the question on several German lips: what is the new armour on these pictures? This Burlington stuff. As for many present, it was the first time they'd seen it, and the large slabby blocks made no sense to the conventional wisdom of the time, which focused on well-angled or cast hulls. The UK confirmed that it had been given clearance at the time to explain the armour to the Germans, on the understanding that it was top secret, and not to leave the room, or be used outside of the remit of the project, a decision the British would later come to regret. After introductions and discussions on what each team did, the UK outlined what they felt was the best means to defeat the armoured threat of the future and the doctrine of the day. These were listed as primarily that any tank would need to be able to operate under a nuclear and chemical threat, against an enemy with greater superiority in resources, a potentially air-adverse situation, and to utilise the ability to fight and manoeuvre at night. They went on to explain that one assumes that any operation will start conventionally, but based on escalating threat could change from conventional to nuclear very quickly, and that any design would need to take this into account. It was felt by those present that the situation with the packed forces of this time was that they were outnumbered by tanks 3.5 to 1, roughly, and that most conflicts would result in a vast rush to seize as much territory as possible and then hold it in a fait accompli move, and I quote, with deep penetrating thrusts into Germany's tender regions, and that this would be done primarily with Soviet armoured and mechanised units, both day and night, with only holding action to the flanks. The Soviet doctrine, they felt, was not to defeat the enemy's armies, but to simply break through as quickly as possible. To counter this, the philosophy was recorded as one of mobile defence. It was felt that any fixed linear defence was doomed to failure, and that these breakouts would be best countered by forces immediately available and capable of rapid concentration of movement to battle locations, and in a strength supported by air assets to make a credible counterattack. Thus, any new tanks would need to be able to meet this criteria and operate in the likely locations, notably the Czech-German borders, and take advantage of the terrain and features present in those areas. The formations had to be able to operate in depth in the chosen area and use flanking manoeuvres to cut off Soviet breakouts, while infantry held the lines and specialist vehicles could be dropped in ahead if needed to slow the Soviet columns. However, the tanks needed to be independent enough that they had enough assets such as bridge layers and armoured recovery vehicles to operate, but not so much dependency in an area that could tempt a preemptive nuclear strike to soften them up. This was then split into a force structure of defensive and offensive elements. The infantry would count as the defensive troops, armed with long-range anti-tank guided missiles and a short mobility range, to pin the Soviet assets, while offensive and mobile formations would be used to counter them at short notice. This emphasis was initially in favouring mobility. To reach the target, enough firepower was needed to deal with the threat, and protection suitable enough to survive the encounter. Supporting these elements would be air, artillery, engineers, anti-air and signals, all of which are essential to making it work. More recently, noted scholars in the subject have argued that this thinking was not accurate, and a lot of doctrinal mistakes were made at the time, rendering the fixed and focused defence to mobile defence argument less reliable. However, while hindsight is a marvellous thing, we must refer to the source material of how they felt at this period. Thus the requirements were set for what the new vehicle would need to have. This led to a primary need for a main battle tank with a high survivability probability, and for those fairly new to this topic, that doesn't just mean armour. It covers everything from crew layout, accessibility, firefighting, detection, hardware, and even visibility. It also needed to have weapons fitted that would be able to destroy any Soviet tanks at combat ranges, and carry enough ammunition that it be self-sufficient. The vehicle had to be mobile, reliable, and easy to maintain in the field, relying less on engineering assets to be in support, therefore providing a more tempting target. It must have a high chance of first strike capability in both day and night. And finally, it must be suitable for conversion into derivatives required by both nations, and to fit those doctrines, such as bridge layers, recovery vehicles and so on. All of these features would need to have natural room for growth and improvement over the years, and so any platform had to be able to take on improvements of the above as time passed without any serious modifications. Now, you might be thinking that this is standard fare for tanks of today, and it is. But believe it or not, many of these features were not commonplace in tank requirements before this date, and these last two requirements in particular would result in several early concepts dropping out. Next up was the gun choices, which needed to be established in advance. The teams went on to explain that the primary weapon should be a tank gun, of which both nations had presented examples. They discussed the gun-missile combination with the Germans, who were relieved to hear that the British had no intention of such a weapon, likely to the joy of the Germans who had already undergone that sorry saga with the Americans on the MBT-70, and didn't fancy going over that ground again. The idea of using heat rounds as a primary form of anti-tank use was also discounted, as the UK felt that while they were ahead of the Soviets in terms of armour, this was only fleeting, and that no doubt in the future the Russians would also develop a similar type of armour to Bovington, which was particularly effective against this type of ammunition. Thus, the only type of gun deemed suitable and proper for a tank is a long kinetic energy gun, of which both sides had been working on. These were still APDS types though, as although APFSDS had been studied since the second half of World War II and was now in use with the Soviet T-62, it wasn't quite the stage they wanted it. These guns had to penetrate the NATO heavy target of 150mm at 60 degrees, or a triple target at combat ranges. However, simply having a larger gun or increasing velocity is not necessarily the right choice, as this increased weight, volume and dimensions, which might have a negative impact on other aspects, and that increased range, while desirable, wasn't always the best move, as most tanks, statistically, fought at closer ranges than simulations on war games would indicate. The UK team then discussed their guns. They went into detail about the 120mm gun as fitted to the Chieftain, and while they felt that it was accurate to 3,000 metres, further growth was impractical, while keeping the vehicle's weight and size to a figure that was. They also discussed the L7 105mm gun, which was an excellent weapon, but with APDS was approaching the limit of its capability. The Germans were also to provide data on this, as it was the same weapon as fitted to their Leopards at the time. The next weapon, first revealed to the Germans, was the 110mm gun, which came in a short and long version. This had been built in secret and already fully tested the year before, along with the British 90mm gun. The 110mm gun, they felt, was the optimum gun for the future main battle tank. Its performance was similar to that of the 120, but similar in overall size to the 105, being 1 metre shorter than the 120mm gun, 200 kilograms less in weight, and the overall ammunition was 15% less in volume. Furthermore, it could fire APDS, heat and HESH, and utilised a combustible case, and along with a new breech system, had a higher overall pressure than the 105mm gun, yet was quicker to operate. The next step was to evaluate the optic systems. It was considered that all tanks should have one conventional optical system, as these were still the cheapest and simplest to use. However, other systems should be used where possible. These systems varied from night vision devices, such as that fitted to the Scorpion, laser illumination, and thermal imaging, which, although had been in the military arsenal since World War I, was only now at the stage where it could be fitted to tanks. The other option was for a full CCTV and interior televisions for driving and so on. However, one must bear in mind that this was the 1970s, when televisions were the size of a fairly well-proportioned hippopotamus, and so were not the easiest things to fit inside a small cramped tank. Nevertheless, any systems designed needed to be effective in identifying a tank out to about 2,500 metres, on about 50% of the average nights in Europe. They also had to provide good all-round vision, with no notable blind spots, and ideally have vision devices for all the crew where possible. Failure to meet these compliances would harm any prospective design from being chosen. A further video is also shown by the Royal Radar establishment on a new system designed for future main battle tank, known as the Remote Viewing System, which shared interfaces for the crew, although at the time of being shown it was still not quite feasible to fit it into a tank properly. The final part of their criteria listed was that on the fire control systems. After briefly going over Chieftain's systems, including her new laser rangefinder, the future systems teams explained that the tank would need to have a fully integrated digital fire control system, gyro-stabilized, that would allow the sights and system to remain locked onto a target regardless of the speed of the host vehicle over rough terrain, and also that of the enemy vehicle. This also included things such as a multi-pulsing laser to keep the range up to date without repulsing, as well as devices that would measure a variety of other considerations, such as barrel temperature and round temperature. Again, these things are taken today as granted, but it is in this project that many of these ideas are mooted for the first time together. These devices had criteria added to them, that they had to be cost-effective, modular, and of a relatively low complexity for the crew. Now, for those of you who have gone through all that, it's time to start taking a look at the tanks themselves. After all, if you've stuck this long, we can begin to cover the first batch of concepts. These are split into categories based on an MLC weight class and then design, being conventional shaped, those with a limited traverse turret, those with external guns, and finally the casemated concepts. These were further split into different arrangements, such as the position of the driver, be it in the hull or the turret, and so on, or with different engine arrangements. Now, before we go any further, it is worth touching on that MLC bit, as this is very important, more so later on, but it affects all the vehicles in the future main battle tank project. The MLC, or Military Load Classification, is a NATO guideline to the maximum weight a bridge or road can handle, be it civilian or military, and takes into consideration the width, length, and so on. To be honest, there's hundreds of pages on the subject, but if your MLC was higher than the number allocated to the bridge or road, you couldn't use it. It must be understood that MLC is not a vehicle's weight, but simply a reference number to what it can or can't access. Thus, a tank that is MLC 60 cannot cross a stone bridge rated as MLC 40, and so on. The importance of this classification cannot be overestimated. If your fast offensive counterattack is to work, you need to know that the bridges and structures on the way can support not only your tanks, but also any support vehicles. If not, then heavy bridging might be required, which will either slow or even prevent the operation. The tanks of the future main Battle Tank 70 were absolutely restricted to this process. If the tank was over MLC 60, it was considered a failure. This also had applications to the vehicle's width as well, but we'll cover that more with the German concepts. So the first British concept vehicles are the MLC 60 conventional tanks. That is a tank that has a conventional layout with a turret up top. These had different engines and crew layouts, as well as guns and loading devices, but fell into the same remit. Of all the designs, they were the ones most favoured by the British teams, as it was a proven concept, a balance of firepower, mobility and protection, within the weight limit and able to operate effectively, both offensively and defensively. So we'll start with MLC 60 Concept 1. This was an evolutionary development of Chieftain, with improvements being a 110mm high velocity gun with 50 rounds, a new integrated fire control system, Trobham armour, and a 1200 horsepower Rolls-Royce ZV12 engine, regulated to 1125 horsepower, delivered to a hydrogas suspension via a 6-speed torque converter with hydrostatic steering. The hull itself took on aspects of the older FV4211 experimental tank, and it had an aluminium endoskeleton with Trobham packs applied over the top. This gave the tank immunity to 105mm APDS over the frontal arc, give or take 20 degrees to the front, and 22 degrees of 5-inch heat protection, while the turret offered the same immunity, but over a 30-degree arc, to both types of munitions. Otherwise, the vehicle was a conventional tank with 4 crew, commander, gunner, driver and loader in the normal places. Although the commander had his own night sight, the others did not. Out of these early projects, she was considered the best original candidate, as in the pros and cons, it was considered to have the optimal design with low risk and good fire on the move capability, and no noted cons. Next up is the future main battle tank conventional concept 2. This was another Class 60 tank with the usual layout, a 4-man crew with a driver front and centre, although she had the built-up cheeks of the FV4211. The main gun was the same 110mm, although this time with 40 rounds, and she came in at a total weight of 55.4 tons. Power was provided by a CV12 TCA 90V up to 1270 brake horsepower and used a TN37 gearbox. Suspension was a hydrogas suspension with 6 road wheels. All crews on this vehicle had a night vision device, and the commander was to have a thermal imager with times-tone stabilised sight, and the gunner had a pulse laser rangefinder, thermal imager, and regular optics. Like the first vehicle, the arm was a mix of aluminium skeleton with Chobham blocks, but thicker packs were able to offer an immunity to 120mm guns over the front 30 degrees, both APDS and heat, while the side packs have an immunity to 84mm heat rounds. Pros were considered to be a low-risk option, and it met the GST requirements for protection, as well as good firepower on the move. However, they also felt there was some poor vision in places, and the adaptability of other vehicles was not ideal. Okay guys, so on to the last of the conventional turreted MLC-60s. Don't worry, there's plenty more tanks to come. The Concept 3 tank was another 4-man vehicle at 55.7 tons, with 110 gun and 40 rounds of ammunition. Night sights for the crew, laser rangefinders, and ballistic computers were to be standard. Power was delivered by a CV16 engine, delivering 1,722 horsepower with a TN38 gearbox, coupled to a hydrogas suspension and 6 road wheels. Like the previous vehicle, she was an aluminium skeleton with chobby packs over the top, and marginally less armour than Concept 2, offering 120mm APDS and heat protection over the front 24 degrees of the hull, and 84mm heat protection over the front 50 degrees of the sides, while the turret is 30 and 90 respectively. Overall, the pros given were good fire on the move, low risk, and an increased acceleration over previous vehicles, while for the cons, a small reduction in hull protection and some issues with the driver's vision were recorded. Well guys, we'll call it a break there. There are a lot more vehicles to come as we progress down the story of Future Main Battle Tank, and more subjects to cover, including an in-depth look at Chobham, the various engines considered, tanks that were dropped early on, and the growing friction between the UK and German teams. Tune in tomorrow and we'll have the next part up for you. And if you did like this, just hit that little subscribe button. It'll help this channel grow and give me more incentive to keep working. So until tomorrow, toodle pip.